All right, welcome in everybody. I know it's going to be late for a lot of the Faeria community, so I don't know how many people have chiming on in tonight, but welcome to my card review stream. This will likely be transitioned over to YouTube afterwards, at least that's the hope. I don't know if it'll be tonight or if I'll send it over to Scream and we will get it done for tomorrow. But something that I really like to get done for the release of Resurgence, something that I want to do for really every set as we get more and more in the Faeria universe. If I can set my camera up in the right place, somewhere about there should be fine. So we just got the final few cards revealed today. Wasn't sure if we were going to have all of them in time, or I shouldn't say in time, but ahead of time. The last part 2 of the last expansion, which was Fall of Everlife, we had a couple cards that were actually kept secret right up until release day. So really excited that we got all of the cards now, so we can actually talk about them. So a lot of where my review is going to come from is, does it fit in a deck currently, potentially taking the place of another card, and then how much value do you place in having the new card versus having the old card? And Faeria's kind of design philosophy for new expansions, just as I turn the music down because it's kind of loud. Their design philosophy for new expansions, as far as what they've said, because they've moved to a buy-to-play model, they don't want it to feel like you have to buy every expansion along the way. They want it to feel like new mechanics introduce something different, rather than just straight-up power creep, basically forcing you to buy the expansion or you won't be able to keep up. So with that in mind, some of the things that they've released in this set are actually really interesting. We, of course, have the quote-unquote Ignis mechanic, the +1 from the Faeria wheel in red. We also have a very interesting opponent's hand size matters cards coming out in yellow, which are going to be very interesting as well. Both of those are the kind of new archetypes that we're seeing. Now, one of the things of Part 1 versus Part 2 is going to be Part 1 is just red and yellow centric, and Part 2 of Resurgence is going to be blue and green focus. So what we see in this Part 1 is actually quite a few neutrals, but strictly yellow and red for the actual color cards. So let's get right into it. The first card, I'm just going to go down the list as you see them on the Resurgence site. So first card here is Tower of Curses. Now this is one that was released actually with the Fall of Everlife. We saw it in a puzzle, I believe just one of the new puzzles that they released for the Fall of Everlife. 4 Faeria, 4 wild land costs, so it does take a little bit before it can actually get on the board. Activate to give a creature -1/-1 and deal damage to this. So similar to a lot of other structures that we have in the game, deal 1 damage to the structure once you activate and actually use the ability. You can kind of compare this to Derelict Tower, which kind of does the same thing. Deal 1 damage is very similar to -1 life, and then deal 1 to the structure as well. Big one for me is actually comparing this to Emperor's Command. Emperor's Command, one of the strong uses of it is the give a creature -2/-1, because if that creature is on 1 life, they will actually die from it, even if they have protection. Fantastic counter to things like King's Faithful when it was played a lot in Rush. We also see it as a great counter to Shaitan Assassin. This potentially could take the place of that card because Emperor's Command is a one use. Tower of Curses actually gets 4 uses if you're using it for the same thing. Now there is that land requirement, but if you're using something that goes into a deep land requirement, you could easily run this instead of the Emperor's Command. Something to consider there is the versatility of the heal. Generally, you don't need it for the structure damage, but there are odd cases where you actually do. But strictly in that comparison, You're looking at Tower of Curses being double the cost, but 4 times the effectiveness if you get to use all of them. It's a very interesting card. So the analysis there, I think, is I see potential in it, but I don't know if it'll be good enough. Just because, like I said, the main card that I'm looking at this potentially taking the place of in current decks is that Emperor's Command, and I just don't think that it's strong enough to replace that versatility in decks that run it. Time will tell, but we will have to see what it looks like. All right, up next is the Imperial Outpost. Now, this is actually one that we had the art revealed way back. It feels like so long ago that this art was actually revealed before the expansions were even in view, really, from the community standpoint. Imperial Outpost is a 2 Faeria cost. All friendly neutral creatures have +1 attack. 2 life on it is not really anything special. Dies to a lot of things very easily. Basically looking at a golden aviary for neutral creatures. Very, very interesting depending on what you're running. There's not really a great just neutral deck. Neutral, if you're running all neutral creatures, very much specializes in the fact that it can build land way faster than your opponent, depending on land ramp that they're running. But if you run something like a neutral rush archetype that is going to try to stop your opponent from building any lands because you can build 2 prairies where they can only build 1 special land, that potentially could work because this makes some of the creatures much more impactful. Something like a Mace Man goes from 4 attack to 5, which ends up being a 1-turn quicker clock to end up killing your opponent. Something like a Steamforged Enforcer, which has 6 attack, then goes to 7, which turns from a 4-turn clock into a 3-turn clock, which is really impactful. I don't know if it's good enough to push an archetype like that into the forefront, and I especially don't think that it's kind of good enough to be run in any deck that currently exists. Even something like a deck that runs Imperial Drake Rider right now, after you proc the Corrupt, it goes to 6. 5 and 6 actually aren't that big of a difference. It's still a 4-turn clock. So you really want to focus on creatures that accelerate the clock a turn quicker. I just don't foresee it fitting into any deck that currently exists, and I don't see a neutral rush that would run Imperial Outpost for that 1-turn quicker clock being better than something like the red rush that we currently have, or the yellow rush, which is really always a staple of every Faeria meta. All right, up next is Radiance, Scourge of Over Sky. So the second card that we see a second copy of, since we already got the second version of Chaos. The second version of Radiance coming out here, 10 Faeria cost, 4 wild lands, flying. Gift, enemy creatures can't move or attack next turn. Very interesting mechanic, very similar to the Ocarina in Pandora, the treasure that you can draft there. Also a 10-10, very solid stat line. Initially, I could see this slotting into something like a Dreamreaver, where you're able to chunk your opponent's health down and Radiant so they can't move. The difficulty with that is you're looking at something like Dreamreaver, and you're probably not in a position to play or to have the Faeria to play both Dreamreaver and Radiance on the same turn and guarantee it. But you're probably looking at Dreamreaver to chunk them down to 10. They respond to the Dreamreaver, then you play Radiance, and they hopefully have nothing left. Dreamreaver is a deck that I think is very close to a top tier, at least on ladder. It really just depends on if you run into Rush or if you run into some more control decks and you can outvalue them. But I just don't see this being good enough in that archetype to kind of hope that your opponent doesn't have the right thing to punish it in a deck that's already very greedy to then throw a greedier card in it. Something like a mid-range deck, something like a green-red Crackthorn, maybe potentially not running Crackthorns because then your deck starts to get more and more expensive as well, but if you're running like a green-red Salamander that runs a lot of small stuff and then Salamanders to pump them up, potentially Radiance could see play in that because you can then value trade in the right positions and really take over the game. It is a deck that can generate some Faeria to build up your Faeria pool and then unleash something big. Generally, it's like a Garridan or a double Crackthorn, double Salamander type of play. But Radiance potentially could fit in something like that. Besides that, Flying Synergy, I don't really see it slotting into anything yellow-based. I think it's very interesting. Currently, I don't see it slotting into any deck that exists, and I don't see it bringing anything new to the forefront. It may need a little bit of testing where you can find a really good use for it, but I'm not seeing it, at least right off the start. Alright, Destructive Volley. 3 Faeria, deal 2 damage to a creature. If it is flying, deal 5 instead. So we get punishment, but with the flying instead of the neutral kind of requirement, secondary requirement on here. Very interesting card because flyers have kind of been pushed to the forefront a lot more. Yellow Flyers has always been a deck that's been really represented in the meta, I'll say. And interestingly enough, Yellow Tempo ran things like Kalim's Training, which gave creatures flying. This could actually come into play against that. And I think a lot of what pushed that archetype was Manta Rider, of course, pre-nerf. And then we also saw the Imperial Drake Rider in the Fall of Everlife. So a card very much designated to take out those. A big thing for Destructive Volley is that it doesn't target some of the big things like Sky Whale, like the new whale that I'll be talking about a little later. It is, I think, interesting enough as a tech choice in tournaments, depending on what you think the meta is going to be, but I don't see it being a card that is everywhere to the same level something like Emperor's Command was. A card that has the versatility and really can just be put into any deck so that you can have a use for it at some point, whatever that use ends up being. There are still a lot of decks on the ladder that don't have any flying creatures in them, and then your Destructive Volley just ends up being 2 damage at an overcost. So it's not a card that I immediately see being played everywhere, but I'm very interested to see if we do see it as a tech choice in some decks in tournament play. All right, next one is Ganana Rainbow Birdship. I unfortunately don't have a picture of the crew that you can get with this, something that's kind of important, but I should be able to kind of list most of them off and then talk about the overall view of it that way. So, Ganana Rainbow Birdship, 6 Faeria, 4 Wild. 4 Wild, a very common thing actually through this expansion. So, actually, I shouldn't even say 4 Wild, but 4 land requirements. So they're trying to put things in that more mid-game level of play, where not early focused, and then not exactly late focus, where you have 6 land requirements, something that you think of more as a late game. Definitely more mid-game focus coming out from some of the cards in this expansion. Flying, naturally, some of the big things that we're seeing through the past couple expansions have been flying, so that sticks to the theme there. The big one here, cards in your hand are wild. Very interesting mechanic coming out. This is a card that, like I mentioned off the start, is one that potentially could push a new archetype. Gift, add a random Ganana crew member to your hand. It costs 0. Also, stats here, 3/7. Very solid, actually, stats. Very weak to removal like Choking Sands. Even something like the Tower of Curses that we're seeing, and potentially like an Aurora's Trick. Something along those lines up really nice here. The crew members are fairly weak creatures in terms of cost stats type of thing, and don't really fit any specific game plan that well, potentially except for one. So just off the top of my head, it is things, the crew members that you can get are Tiki Piper, Rakoan Reveler, Hunted Outlaw, Storyteller, what's the Explorer called? Cartographer. I believe there's one more, but I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. But basically all of these creatures are 2 or 3 costs, so the reduction down to 0 doesn't make a huge impact. I think the Tiki Piper is actually the most interesting out of it in terms of playing Ganana in something like a green-blue enchantment style deck. Just because Ganana is a 3/7, so you can also focus the enchantment synergy there. And then the Piper gives you a free +4 life and attack buff, depending on the way that you can line it up. Don't know if it'll be good enough because it is random. You can't always rely on that, and most of the other ones don't fit an archetype well enough. Potentially we see this in like a green-red that just wants to swarm the board, or a blue-yellow that just wants to swarm the board as well. Right, so going back to the cards in your hand are wild as far as a new mechanic for a deck that could come about from this. Potential there, but I don't see it good enough to be you're running cards that you otherwise normally wouldn't be able to play for this time when you have Ganana on board and then you're able to play them. It just seems kind of counterintuitive as far as like deck building is even concerned. I would absolutely love if this was gift, change all cards in your hand to wild. I think it'd have a lot of potential that way, because then you could kind of wait for the right time, the right cards in hand, and then unleash that type of power. I really do like them pushing this wild mechanic, though. It's very interesting when Day of the Dragons, when Magda got changed to this. We, of course, saw Spirit Theft and the Fall of Everlife, and then Ganana now pushing it in another different direction, where as long as you can protect her, you can actually get some value out of cards that you otherwise wouldn't be able to play. I'm really interested to see if somebody will come up with something good for this, a deck that actually plays well, but right now I just don't see it as good enough to overtake other things. All right, Enslaved Priest comes up next. 3 Faeria 2/3. It is whenever a creature you control triggers a corrupt ability, drain 2 life from your opponent. This is a fantastic synergy archetype that I love to see. I was really hoping for something like this once Corrupt was introduced in the previous expansion of Fall of Everlife. I was really hoping we would see something exactly like this, where if you trigger Corrupt or if your opponent triggers Corrupt, something else happens. 3 Faeria 2/3 is pretty average. We have things like the Imperial Guard that is a 3 Faeria 2/3 as well. I'm not 100% sure on if this slots into enough decks to make it worthwhile. It's going to need, I think, a lot more testing once it's out to see what cards line up the right way. There's no real corrupt mechanic or a corrupt ability that plays into like a burn mechanic archetype, except for something like Baldurian, where you could potentially trigger the corrupt, get the drain from this, then get the hammer and just start hammering your opponent over and over. It's something that I'm very interested in, but I just don't know yet the deck kind of enough that it fits into, where you can play to trigger corrupt enough times to make the drain actually worthwhile. That being said, in a control type of deck, in something like a blue control where you're potentially running Hydras, you can trigger that corrupt ability and have the drain to actually heal yourself to defend against rush or mid-range kind of race situations. I'm very interested to see if it finds some space in those types of decks as a healing mechanic rather than as the burn. I think this is a very, very interesting card, and I absolutely love seeing the corrupt synergy come out. All right, Shows in the Sky Eater comes up next. 6 Faeria, 5 Wild, 6/6. We see, of course, another whale, and this time they start it off as a legendary instead of having to eventually nerf it there like Moby was. Flying in charge 3, a lot of movement around the board, same as the other Sky Whale that we have in the game. The first time chosen would kill a creature in combat, instead swallow and gain control of it. Wording's kind of a little awkward here. I like to think of this as the card basically checks if the first time chosen attacks, and I guess the wording's not that bad. Would kill a creature in combat. No, it's something like the first time chosen attacks if it would kill the creature, instead swallow and gain control of it. The wording is just a little wonky in the way that it has to. Sorry, the first time it attacks and survives. That's kind of the main differentiating factor here that got some confusion right off of the release, but we've since kind of cleaned it up. So the basics of Chosen are it's a 6/6. Once you attack into something, as long as it would die and Chosen would survive, Chosen stays a 6/6, doesn't take any damage, and it swallows that creature, and then you actually gain control of it. So it's a kind of double swing where you remove their creature and they have to then remove Chosen, and after that they then have to remove that other creature that you've swallowed. I'm very, very interested to see if we get some sort of blue mid-range that uses Humbling Vision and takes advantage of this, because the Swallow is actually a base creature. So anything that would be potentially a 6/6, if you're looking at a Verduran Force, anything bigger than Chosen that would normally trade, if you can use Humbling Vision and actually reduce that to a point that Chosen attacks and kills it, your Humbling Vision ends up being essentially like a Last Nightmare plus, because you've kept your creature alive in a good way. It didn't take damage. You've removed their creature, and you get that base stat back afterwards. So something like a Verduran Force, like I mentioned, you drop that down to a 4/4 with Humbling Vision, Chosen attacks. You then get a 7/7 as the swallowed creature. I think that is the most interesting kind of potential line. The other ones that are out there would be either dealing some damage first to bigger creatures, or playing Chosen in green and actually buffing it up with Elderwood Embraces, Tiki Caretakers, something along those lines, where you get it to a bigger point than whatever your opponent's creature is. And then not only do they have to remove that, but you also have Chosen as a bigger and bigger creature as well. Kind of similar to what we actually saw from the Sky Whale the first time, which initially was swallow and then gain stats. Chosen is just swallow and gain the creature. It's very interesting, kind of in the same way Maginata is from the Fall of Everlife, because you have that big creature and then another creature inside. It's just more and more control onto the board. I'm very interested in the power that Chosen's actually going to have. Very, very important as well that it has 6 life. Very difficult for a lot of things to fight into. You have things like Cypher, Groundshaker, Ancient Herald, Grove Guardian, that are all 5/6s that are pretty important cards in a lot of decks. Chosen can just clean all of those up, but also because we have Punishment in the game, which would target a neutral creature like this, and we also have Destructive Volley released in this set, which does target flying, which Chosen is. So very important that the 6 life actually does make a lot of difference here, instead of having it as something with a higher attack, so it potentially kills more, but a lower life that can be removed much easier. This potentially could be the best card of the set, or at least the most widely played card of the set. It just depends if those decks are good into whatever is meta after the meta settles from these cards being out. All right, so now we get into some of the colors here. So starting with the red, Bursting Hippo. Very interesting card coming out here. 6 Faeria, 3 mountains, 5/5. Combat, deal 2 damage to all adjacent enemies. Also, very importantly, it is a beast. One of the things that I think they're trying to push here a little bit in this set is green-red beasts. We, of course, have a very popular green-blue beasts on ladder, utilizing the Orphan Fugu, Hunt Down, and then a lot of other beasts in green. Bursting Hippo is actually very reminiscent to, I believe it was the original Firebringer in the early access days of Faeria, which was combat deal 2 damage, I think just to all enemies. It was across the board. It may have been to just enemy creatures. Bursting Hippo also very reminiscent as a kind of mini Slam for any of you who would have played during that time. Slam was a mechanic that when the creature attacks, it dealt the damage to all adjacent enemies as well. Bursting Hippo kind of brings both of those into one more controlled, balanced setup here. So basically, your opponent can't hide small creatures behind the big ones. This will punch through. Very important for an anti-swarm mechanic. Something like Green-Yellow Sack, while it can't necessarily kill the Bone Collector, if you can do a little bit of damage and then attack in, the extra damage will punch through and actually clean that back line up. Also pretty well statted. 6 Faeria for a 5/5. You look at something like Ground Shaker is 6 Faeria for 1 more life, and then a gift instead of this combat effect. Big thing with this is Gift of Steel is getting a change, so we'll have to see what that ends up being before we can really know the power of Hippo. But I really like it. I really like this card right off the initial view. It fits pretty well into a lot of kind of mid-range red. I think it fits well into a green-red. 3 mountains isn't too bad to get to, especially if you're playing Crackthorn. That's going to go to 3 mountains anyway. Even Emerald Salamander gets to 2, so you're just looking at creating 1 more on the turn that you actually need the Hippo. I don't know if it'll be good enough, but I'm very interested in the potential of this card. Alright, so keeping with the beasts synergy, Beast Trainer is the next card that comes up here. 5 Faeria, 1 mountain, and 2 wild. Gift, reduce the cost of a random beast in your hand by 5. And it is a 3/3. Being a 5 cost itself, as long as you hit a beast with over 5 starting Faeria cost, you basically get a free 3/3 onto the board. Again, because it's 1 mountain and 2 wild, I really think it's going to fit well into something like a green-red beasts. I think that's kind of the direction that they're pushing with these 2 cards, is looking at something where you can play Beast Trainer into something green, into Hunt Down, and start to kind of get that snowballing, especially with the synergy of green-red of the Emerald Salamander. The problem that I see right off the bat is that deck is actually going to be pretty high cost in terms of kind of the average Faeria cost of the deck, especially if you're running... I just don't know if it can actually even run Crackthorn, because Salamanders are 6. If you're running the Hippo, that's 6. Beast Trainer is 5, and while, yes, it can get discounts, if you don't have anything on the board, you potentially don't have enough to start a snowball going. And then if you're looking at something like Ancient Boars, Rotting Boars, those are 5 as well. Again, you can see some discounts, but it would be a very momentum-based deck. I could see it working. I definitely see the potential in it. It's something that I'm very interested in. But as far as beasts go, will that be good enough to push green-blue beasts out? That'll be the big question that I have. I don't know right now if it's going to be, just because green-blue has a pretty good popularity, I would say. But I'm very, very interested to see what this does for something like a red-green. And even to put this Beast Trainer into the blue-green that already exists isn't that bad. Just like I mentioned on the Hippo, that 3 mountain, this is only 1 mountain, so you basically just make the mountain on the turn that you need it. And for a free 3/3, it just depends on what it replaces in your deck, if it makes it worthwhile. Alright, up next we get into kind of a bridge between another new mechanic, the Ignis mechanic, and something that could actually fit well into really any type of red control deck. Ignacy Ritualist. 4 Faeria, 3 mountains, 3/3. Gift, refresh your power wheel. Corrupt, refresh your power wheel. So, potentially, if you were using it just for the +1 Faeria, this is actually a 2-cost 3/3. And if you're able to also swing some extra value into that +1 with cards like Ignis or the other ones that I'll be getting to here, you can actually get a lot more value than that. One I'm actually really interested in is if this just plays as an actual good fire elemental. Fire elemental for a long time has basically been the weakest one because outside of land ramp, which red doesn't particularly need, fire elemental just doesn't have good enough stats to see play. It's very weak to a lot of removal, having only 2 life, and the 5 attack doesn't make a big enough difference for red to actually see play. Ignacy Ritualist, I actually think can, for a very big reason. A lot of the red control decks right now are running things like Havoc, Baldurian, which are 5 mountains, but they don't really have anything good on 4 mountains, unless you're running Krog, or I believe Cap 10 is 4. But that's, I think, 2 mountain, 2 wild. Potentially is 2 mountain, 3 wild, but I think it's 4 in there. Ignacy Ritualist kind of bridges the gap between those 2 power points of red, which is get to 3 mountains and then play stuff. And then they kind of want to either start to extend lands for Silent Horsemasters if you're using those in the deck, and then potentially just drawing into other removal wherever you need it. They don't really want to go to 4 mountains until you have to go to 5 for something like a Havoc, but then sometimes you just end up with dead cards in hand because you don't have the requirements. Ignacy Ritualist, I think, is really good on turn 3. Mountain, mountain, mountain. Ritualist on turn 3 gets you your 4th mountain, and then you're actually looking at 5 mountains very easily, or drawing, and once you need that 5th one, playing the 5th mountain. It's something that I think can fit in that type of a slot for the deck actually really, really well. And I would be really not surprised to see it take the place of things in that type of a archetype. I think that's a really interesting use for it. The Corrupt, if you can trigger it, just makes the value even better. I think if you're looking at refreshing the power wheel just to make another land, you're looking at exactly the same cost as an elemental. It's exactly the same stats as water elemental. It doesn't have the jump, but it does have the Corrupt. So maybe you can get that value out later on. I don't see it being that good for the +1 because you're basically paying 3 Faeria for nothing. It just depends on how much value you can get out of that +1 with either creatures on the board or whatever else you're going to do. But if you're only using it for the +1, you're basically going like +1, Ritualist, +1. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially in late game scenarios. But I'm very, very interested to see if it becomes a staple kind of bridge card for red combat land ramp, or red controls land ramp. All right, next one in the +1 archetype is Wrath of Ignis. 6 Faeria, 3 mountains. Again, that 3 mountain being a very important point like I talked about. This is deal 4 damage randomly split among enemies, the exact same ability that Ignis has. Costs 1 less for each time you've selected +1 from the power wheel this game while in your hand or deck. Obviously, because if you played it, it would be gone and it wouldn't be able to get any cost reductions. The instant comparison that I have for it is if all 4 ticks of the damage hit the same creature, it's technically a firebomb. So you only need to +1 twice to get it down to what is technically the right value for it, as if you were playing firebomb instead. Now the random element brings that down even further, so you'd really want to get this free. Technically, if you can get it down to 1 or 2, it would be worth playing, and then it just does the damage line up the right way. In any kind of red combat right now, red control right now, I don't see this taking the place of anything specifically. It would be very good in an Ignis deck if that ends up being kind of a top tier archetype. But realistically, I see that archetype without Ignis being more played than with him. So then you're looking at the other cards that are potentially lining up that same style of synergy. Now, that being said, there are a lot of times where you just need to +1, or where you're getting close to fatigue and you just go to +1 because you don't want to draw more cards than your opponent. Potentially, this actually gets a lot of value in something like a fatigue red that just wants to play defensive, wait for your opponent to basically expend all their resources, and then just wait for them to slowly die, because every single creature they play, you clear off with either events or your creatures, and then you just sit back and wait and wait and wait. And at the end of the game, you have these, and you just speed up that fatigue. But if you were going to play that archetype, you already win without having this 4 damage, just because you're playing to that win condition, that you're just clearing everything your opponent does, and you don't actually need 4 damage randomly at the end of the game. You need something like a firebomb in the middle of the game. So I don't see it taking the place of any deck in a red control right now. It just depends on how strong something like a +1 deck is. If you can gain enough value while waiting for this to come online, and then the RNG factor of it really decreases the potential value. And it is also enemies, so it can go to the orb, potentially better for burn, but not when it's random. I mean, we have Hellfire that sits at 7 Faeria and 9 damage, and yes, it's played sparingly, I'll say. But I just don't see this kind of being good enough to make it worth it. All right, the next card in the +1 archetype is Flamestoker. 5 Faeria, 3 mountains, 4/4. A little low statted at the start, but whenever you select +1 from the power wheel, this gains +1/1. So your first +1 gets it to a 5 Faeria 5/5, which is average, I would say. You look at things like Toe Ship, you also have Windborn Champion. 5 Faeria, something like Ancient Herald is potentially one of the best with a low enough land requirement. We, of course, have Theory and Golem as the big one, but you also have things like Royal Judge, which is a 5 Faeria 1/1. So I think 5 Faeria 5/5 is average, and then every single one up from there, you start gaining value. I don't know if it's, again, I don't know if it's good enough to see that archetype pushed to a top tier deck. I think it's a very good for Pandora card, just because you can play it and then +1. Once you're after Pandora, you don't have the ability to collect, so you need to +1 a lot more often. Red just kind of paying 5 for this in the turn that you also then need to +1. If it gets cleared right away, you're kind of left with nothing. And you're also competing in that 5 slot for Ground Shakers. You're competing with Cypher. It's a very difficult slot for red to actually see this get that much play. Again, unless that +1 synergy is a top tier deck, I just don't see this being better than other things that are currently played in red. All right, next up is the Cobalt Smuggler. 5 Faeria, 1 mountain, 5/3. Corrupt, summon a 4/3 Cypher's Fodder in a random adjacent place. Love this card for 2 things. Red Rush looks very strong for a Red Rush archetype, because especially if you're player 2, you can double Prairie, explore Mountain, and then you're that 1 space away in that sweet spot where your opponent has to either defend or let the damage punch through. That then sets up a decently easy corrupt for the following turn. Very important to note as well, because it is a corrupt, it's actually impossible for your opponent to stop the fodder, to deny the fodder from spawning, because your creature has to move from a land onto your opponent's land. And that means that land that they move from is going to be open all the time. There's no way to block that. So the fodder will, at minimum, always spawn on the land that the smuggler just moved from. Second thing that makes this very interesting is an angry archetype, which is decks in red that have higher attack than life, and that increases the power of Firebringers down the line, decreases the cost of Hate Seeds, depending on the way that you want to build the deck. This would actually count as 2 summons for those. And we also, in the Fall of Everlife, had the Spite Sprite, which is a 2/1, also builds into that same synergy. That also kind of lines up if you wanted to go into red-yellow, which in the past was pretty strong when that archetype was released. And that was because you can play something like a Demon Wrangler, which is a summon on its own, and also then summons the Demon Wing, which counts as a summon as well. So you kind of double dip in a few different ways. If you wanted to run that style, you can also gain access to something like Orodrum Fanatic for movement, increasing the reach you have to trigger the Corrupt mechanic, and also still playing into that angry archetype. That pushes you basically to a 2 red, 2 mountain, 2 desert requirement for meeting most of your creatures, and then it just kind of depends on edge cases here and there. It was a deck that was powerful in the past, and I would love to see come back because I think it's very interesting. It plays very mid-rangey where you're just fighting in the early game, and then you eventually just out-tempo your opponent with either minimal or zero-cost Hate Seeds and giant Firebringers. It's an archetype that hasn't been around for quite a long time just because Angry Gnats were kind of a staple of it when they were 2/1s. You could really accelerate that off, and then they went to 1/1s, and it just wasn't as powerful. I really like that they're bringing certain tools back that could increase that archetype again. I don't see this Smuggler being a card that fits in any type of control or anything like that. Potentially could find itself in something like a red-green, where it's an early 1 mountain card. Generally, red-green has run something like Axe Grinders in the past just as a turn 1 play. This can be if you're player 2. Now, you can't always guarantee that, but just to have something like this down where it's a creature that potentially summons another creature on a low requirement so that you could go like 1 mountain and then into green, or green and then into 1 mountain and play this, kind of does fit that archetype. Just not sure what it would replace in there. It is worth noting that the 3 life is pretty low. Wind Soldier, Water Elemental, things like that can clear it off very easily and pick up value for your opponent. But it is, I think, good enough to see play. I'm just not sure which archetype will run it more. It will very likely be Red Rush. It just depends on how strong that archetype is. All right, I'm actually going to skip down a few here because the Thunder Eel fits really nicely into what I was just talking about, which is the red-yellow angry archetype. 6 Faeria, 2 mana, 2 yellow, 6/4, again fits into that higher attack than life. Flying creature, gift, deal 2 damage if it is on an deal 2 damage to a creature. If it is on an ocean space, deal 4 damage instead. So again, we have that kind of hate card where you are targeting something with an extra ability with some extra damage, similar to Punishment, similar to Destructive Volley. Now, technically, over an ocean space could be aquatic or flying, but there's rarely aquatic that sees play right now that actually focuses on being over the ocean space. Gabrian Commander being an odd exception, and Beru being the other. A lot of times Beru ends up being over land just because it creates the lakes and it can stay over land. But the odd time you do have it over a lake or over an ocean, and you can actually take advantage. This definitely seems more focused at killing flyers. So we end up with 2 flyers hate cards in this set. And if they are popular, we'll see flyers completely fall out of the meta. Thunder Eel can very easily target something like the Drakkar Sky Captain. It kills that off right away. It kills Manta Rider. It kills a pre-corrupt Drake Rider. Yes, it is 4 lands, so you do have to kind of get a little deeper into the game to actually play it. But if you wanted to, and you want to go something like Air Elemental, you can potentially proc this on turn 3 before they get any value or minimal value out of their creature. It is kind of a big cost, not only in terms of the requirement, like I just mentioned, but 6 Faeria as well is kind of deep, depending on the archetype that you're playing it in. I don't really see something like a red-yellow control coming back to the forefront. It was an archetype that we've had in the past. But for something like an angry, where you can play this to clear something and then have the body left behind to clear something else, it potentially finds value that way. It's just generally your red-yellow is a lot of small stuff to pump up your Firebringers and Hate Seeds as quick as possible and then dump a ton of value onto the board. And this doesn't quite fit into that. I'm very interested to see if this does find some uses. It just, to me right now, it's a little high cost to be like just the 4 damage focused, and then a little high cost to fit into that archetype that I think it suits best. All right, so let's get into the yellow cards here. The first one, which I potentially think could be the best card of the set, I think just because stats plus ability here. It'll be very interesting to see how this card ends up lining up. But Dustbringer Wraith, 4 Faeria, 2 Desert, 1 Wild, which are oddly enough flipped there in their reveal from the way that they should be. Oh, actually, no, that is the way that it should be, because it always prioritizes the lower and flips them around in their deck builder. 3/6 creature, which is, I think, pretty good for a 4 cost. Most of the time we're looking at 5 cost being that 3/6. I know it does have 1 extra land requirement compared to something like the Shed and Brute, something like Kaleem. Yeah, I had a really tough time right on seeing this going, yeah, that's pretty overstated, I think. I'm really hoping it gets released as a 3/5 tomorrow. I would be fine with that, I think, but 3/6 for 4 is pretty darn good. And then you also have a positive ability on top of that, Corrupt. Increase the cost of each card in your opponent's hand by 1. Interesting combo that a lot of people were talking about right off the bat, because it needs 1 wild and Rapala needs 1 blue. You can play Rapala on the turn that you're going to trigger the Corrupt, fill your opponent's hand with garbage, and then increase all of those ruby fish by 1. They get to 2 cost, and they're basically just dead, where you can never get them out of your hand. Odd cases, your opponent actually will be able to get those ruby fish out with Rapala, and then it just depends on what you're actually milling from them if you got a lot of value. But with this, it looks incredible to me. Even without that Rapala combo as kind of the go-to there, just in something like a yellow control where you're looking at playing a solid, probably not even yellow control, probably something like a yellow tempo. This slots in very nicely. 3/6 is good stats to control. Something like Kaleem's Training takes it to 4/6, which is really nice. Even without that, a lot of times the yellow can clear off a lot of the remaining life of creatures with Spirit Theft, with Soul Drain, with maybe a Wind Soldier. And then you also have the movement in yellow, Flash Winds, Fanatics, to proc that Corrupt in an even better spot. If you're able to get this off early in the game, you should just win. Potentially it even fits into Yellow Rush, because if your opponent doesn't have an immediate answer, and then you step onto their land, they don't have creatures set up to collect, means they can't get anything down to defend, means you end up increasing the costs in their hand, means you now have an even harder time getting stuff onto the board, and you basically just lose from there. I think this is as powerful a card as I think it is, because it fits into such a broad scope of decks. Tempo, Control, and Rush, I think, could all see this card see play. I think it's potentially the strongest card of the set, in my opinion, just because of the max potential, but also the minimum potential. If this doesn't get removed right away, and it's in a situation where or I should say, if you play this in a situation where it has to get removed right away, you at minimum don't lose value on it. Because it's a 3/6, yes, it can get Choking Sand, but that is a 4/4 exchange, and if you had the kind of first advantage onto the board, you then have first advantage again because your opponent just cleared your creature and didn't play anything else. If they have to use a Last Nightmare, Frogify, anything along those lines, you gain value. Alright, next card up is the Blightborn Spectre. 5 Faeria, 2 Desert, 3/6. Like I mentioned, 5 is usually the cost we see that stat line at. Charge 2 gives it a lot of reach along the board. Yellow really likes creatures that have charge 2. Production, if your opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, this gains +1/1. So if you're able to play this on turn 2 and your opponent hasn't got anything down yet, it'll trigger right away. And then you're at a 4/7 and it just goes off from there. Big thing here is that it is a production, which means it can trigger over and over and over again. It's not something like a gift where it only triggers once, not something like a corrupt where it only triggers once. This can get out of control really quickly. And the other thing is that it can actually force your opponent to be inefficient in certain ways because you're looking at that production triggering every single turn. If your opponent has something in hand that isn't really optimal to play, but then they would get over 4 cards in hand and then this starts getting snowballing, they may have to just play a creature out onto the board that then you can clear and they wouldn't be able to use as optimally. So I'm very interested to see what this does. Also is a kind of counter to greedier decks, something like a Dream Reaver very easily targets something like that. So definitely see this being a card that yellow will use. I don't know if it's good enough to take... It actually could potentially just replace Manta Rider in something like a yellow tempo right now. Charge 2, which Manta Rider lost recently on the nerf. It's a 3/6, which is technically a better stat line than the 5/3 of the Manta Rider, even though the Manta has the last words that can kind of guarantee that you get collection afterwards. The Blightborn Spectre just has better stats that kind of guarantee it that way. So this potentially just takes the place of Manta Rider in that style of deck. Next one is Haunted Husk. 1 Faeria, 2 Desert Structure. Production, if your opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, draw 1 card and drain 1 life from your opponent. Again, looking at that opponent's hand size matters. Synergy, archetype, kind of whatever you want to call it there. Really interesting way that they put these in because they're productions. Your opponent has their turn to kind of go, okay, I have to get cards out of my hand, versus can I take the effect of whatever it is going to be. This card I kind of dismissed right off the bat just because I wasn't really sure the power level that it was going to have. I didn't see it being as so good that you would just have to get it in a deck. But the more that I've thought about it, and the similar way that I talked about the Spectre there, if you can force your opponent to make an inefficient play, this card is instantly worth it. And if they have to take the damage from it, so be it. You draw the card, drain life from them. Potentially could go in a rush, but I don't know if that's kind of worth it because your opponent just wants to throw stuff at the board when you're rushing. But something like a tempo could very easily include this as a 1 or 2 of. That's their version of Forbidden Library, essentially. You can kind of run things like Soul Pact, which deals the damage to you. You gain the extra Faeria, and then you're able to play more onto the board. This gets the extra card draw, potentially drain 1 back to heal you back up after. Even the tempo that we're used to seeing with Shaitan Demons, eventually that damage can add up. So if you're able to recover it, this card actually can get a lot of value. I'm honestly not sure with the cards in yellow that are being released if we'll see some kind of new tempo come about, but I'm very interested to see if that happens. I don't see this being a 3 of your whole deck revolves around the Husk, but I could definitely see a 1 or 2 where if you get value, it's definitely worth it. Oops. All right, next card up, the... no, we still have a few more yellows to go. The Barren Sky Vulture. 4 Faeria, 4 Deserts, 0/3. is a beast, which I don't think is as important when you're looking at 4 deserts, just doesn't have the same level of synergy. Is flying, so again, those hate cards that we talk about do exist, so it gets targeted by that. 3 life also gets targeted by a lot of other things. Gift, destroy a creature with 1 life and drain its attack. Is good as a smaller type removal, similar to Spirit Theft, where it's just the 1 damage and then you get a copy of that creature. This also targets, just like I talked about earlier with the Tower of Curses, creatures with 1 life and protection. You can actually just take that right away, ignore the protection altogether. The downside to that is a lot of those don't have the greatest attacks. Looking at Shaitan Assassin, even King's Faithful is only 4. So 4/3, while it is good for a 4 cost, just not as good with that card just not being seen in the meta. I like the kind of interesting approach to it. I just don't see it being strong enough. Basically, if you're destroying a creature with 1 life, that creature already got value off of one of your other creatures, and you should probably just have Spirit Theft in if you wanted to deal that 1 remaining damage rather than something like the Vulture. Just don't see it being good enough to take the place of Spirit Theft, and don't see it being a real counter to anything specifically. And like I just said, you've already lost value, or I shouldn't say you've lost value, but your opponent has gained value through the creature combat already. So it's not like you recover enough to actually take advantage there. Next one up, the Barren Sky Vermin. Barren Sky must be kind of a region in wherever this is kind of taking place, the battle here. Just because we had the Vulture and the Vermin. So 1 Faeria, 2 deserts, beast again, so you can get some synergy there. 1/1, gift, fight your opponent. So slam this down, deal 1 damage to your opponent. Rush is going to love this because even if you have defenses, this is a guaranteed way to proc prayer. Not a lot of really good kind of hand buff where you can build this up and then unleash a bunch of damage. Look at things like Court Jester. Potentially this sees some play in like a green-yellow sacrifice. It's not even that bad to play onto the board, deal that 1 damage to your opponent, and then just use it as a sacrifice target. That actually decreases the max potential that you have to get Soul Eater to, and with the recent change to Soul Eater to not continue growing on the board, maybe that change is actually, or maybe that a little bit of damage actually is needed eventually down the line. Don't think there's anything as far as beast synergy goes where you can buff this up in hand, but potential. There is potential here. I just don't see it being better than anything that already exists. And I also should note in there with the yellow rush, prayer is getting changed as well. So if that decreases a lot in value, then this won't really be played as the setup for that. Final card here is the Vile Bloatfly. 2 Faeria, 4 Desert, 3/3. 3/3 is actually insane for a 2 Faeria cost card. Flying and corrupt, add a Vile Bloatfly to your hand. Really interesting potential of this card where if you can get it down and proc that corrupt, you get another one. Proc that corrupt, you get another one. You can continue cycling these cards in your hand. Very important that it does not have any extra mobility. If it had something like a charge 2, very easy to proc that corrupt. Potentially we see this in some sort of a flyers list where you are also running the tower, which gives charge 3 to a creature. This can be very good with that. You're also running a lot of movement in those type of a deck. It just suffers a little early, and then you have to pick that back up late game. Vile Bloatfly is easy enough for your opponent to remove, but you gain value on that. Something like the 2 Faeria cost there. Looking at a Flame Burst to remove this is extra value gained. If it's trading with like a water elemental, you've gained value on that. It also can take out things like the Manta Rider, something like the Smuggler that is also coming out tomorrow. There are very important cards on 3 life that this can actually target and gain value back. I'm very, very interested to see if there's some sort of swarm deck that can really effectively use this card, because I think if you trigger it once, you just snowball the game from there so easily. If it collects, it was a 1 cost. If you're able to corrupt proc in the right way that you've double collected, it was a 0 cost, and you traded, and you play another creature. I think something like this can snowball out of control insanely quickly. I don't really know right off the bat if it's good enough that it fits in kind of every yellow the same way that I think the Wraith will, but I definitely think there are archetypes that will run more kind of swarmy cards that this really wants to get in. All right, and that's going to conclude the review here for Resurgence. Resurgence, of course, comes out tomorrow, September 19th. Very, very excited to play all of the cards that are available there, all of the different things that are coming out, either if it is in a deck that already exists, whether it is in a deck that is going to come about because of the new archetypes that are created by these cards. Overall, I really think that they have stuck to their philosophy. When the devs of Faeria changed to the buy to play, they really emphasized that they didn't want expansions to feel like you needed to buy them. They wanted them to feel different. They wanted them to be newer mechanics or different types of maybe similar mechanics, where we have like Ignis that already exists. Now we get that +1 synergy, whereas Fall of Everlife introduced Corrupt. So those types of new things that are brought about to the game, new mechanics, and new cards in that way, rather than being just cards that are a little bit stronger and you're forced to buy the expansion to kind of keep up on ladder or in tournaments. That being said, the Wraith, I think, is kind of the big one for me. Chosen is another very strong card, I think. It just depends if you can actually get the right use out of it, because there are a lot of times where it doesn't get the max value out of its ability, and it is a 6 cost, so something like Last Nightmare finds it very well. I think overall this set's really interesting. There are a couple archetypes that it looks like they're trying to bring back in the Red Angry, potentially the Red Green instead of the Blue Green beast that we're seeing a lot right now. There's also the new mechanics of the opponent's hand size matters and that +1. Overall, I think it's going to be pretty good for the meta. That being said, there are other changes coming out as well. We've seen that there are some nerfs coming, and they've also said there are some other balance changes, potentially buffs coming as well. So Faeria Resurgence should bring a pretty good swing to the meta. If you enjoyed the video here, whether you're watching on Twitch or whether you're watching this on YouTube at a later time, and you enjoyed it and you want to see me stream more of the actual game itself, hit that follow button down below. If you're on YouTube, subscribe there. You can see more content from me upcoming in the future. Definitely want to do card reviews and that sort of thing, potential DLC reviews once each one comes out. So we will have another one next month when the next 20 cards are revealed for part 2 of Resurgence. Besides that, you guys can find me streaming generally Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday evenings on Twitch, Metagamingtv, as you can see the logo right there. That is Eastern Daylight Time, which I believe right now is 1 a.m. GMT. If I did the math right, I think it's 6 hours difference right now. But yeah, that's going to do it for me for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed my card review for the first set of Resurgence. I'm very, very excited, like I said, to get into playing all of these cards. And I will see you guys next time.